This is Crew Tales, Life in the Circus. In the motion picture world, there are an army of dedicated professionals who work behind the scenes to make the movies and shows we watch today. I'm Brad Hodson, and I've spent over 30 years in the motion picture industry. This podcast celebrates the people who make the magic behind the scenes. Mikah Sharkey, welcome to the circus.
Thank you for having me.
Describe in your words what you do for a living.
That's an interesting question because I feel like it changes from job to job and overall as a cinematographer, I feel like what I get to do every day is go and play with toys in a sandbox and create something really cool. My job in its official capacity is that I'm the one who's responsible for the image that goes into the camera and gets delivered to post production so that they can make a movie. And that usually involves working with every other department, most of all with the director. But yeah, at the end, even though there's so much work that goes in from everyone from production design to the folks that are there on the day, putting down pylons, making sure no one gets in our shots, ultimately, it's my responsibility to make sure that the story is captured.
How did you describe your journey to get where you are today?
I guess if we're going to tell my whole life story, like my journey is kind of a weird one in a lot of ways because when I first started shooting was about 20 years ago now in 2005, the first time I ever shot a tiny little corporate video. And the reason that I actually got into that was because I got really sick, and don't worry, this is going somewhere. I got really sick when I was in high school, and I ended up in the hospital for a couple weeks. And when I got out, I was super far behind in my classes. And the um the folks, the student counselor people who try and help you out, they said to me you have enough credits to graduate if you want to drop one of your courses and take an elective. So I dropped French in an instant because I was really bad at it. And my girlfriend at the time was in film studies class, which I was like, film studies? That sounds great. I get to watch movies and do nothing. So I signed up for that. And I ended up just totally falling in love with it because the instructor that we had, the teacher of that class, was this staunch hardcore feminist who really opened up my eyes to not only sort of the more subliminal things that we see in film and television, but also just the way that stories are told and the way that the camera helps to tell those stories through really subtle ways. And from there, I got the chance to compete in Skills Canada competition. I ended up winning gold in regionals for Vancouver Island, and that sent me to the provincials where I didn't rank, but that was enough that when I was working at I was working at a hockey school as an instructor back then because I'd played hockey all my life. I was a goaltender, and they wanted to start shooting corporate videos for other companies that they collaborated with. And the first one of those was for a company called Kinklo Mat, which is this triangular mat in varying densities that you could jump up on and get your. I used to be a hockey instructor. I don't even know the name of the exercise now, but anyways, makes you stronger. So my very first job was shooting this commercial with the world's ricketiest jib arm you'd ever seen and a handy cam. Um, and from there, I got a bursary to go to BCIT from that hockey school. And when I was in BCIT, um, I met a member of the executive board for IATSE 669, who was our cinematography teacher at the time, Doug Franks, who's no longer with us. Um, and his letter of recommendation at the end of the course is what got me into 669's training program. And I was 20 years old at the time, but because I had his recommendation and because I aced the practical exams and the written exams, they were like, "Okay, kid, we're gonna take a shot on you." I'd never been on a big set in my life, and suddenly I was working on second unit feature films and stuff like that, and uh, that had its challenges, particularly back then, where I feel even what is that, 15 years ago now, the environments were a lot different to work on when it came to being an up and comer and having to work with the hardened veterans of that time who came from a very different era. And then I worked as a camera assistant for, uh, gosh, like almost 14 or 15 years. And all the time on the side, I was trying to shoot my own stuff and like mostly just having fun with it. Like when DSLRs started being able to shoot video. So a lot of my friends were circus performers or people who were in the flow arts community. And every year they had a festival in the summer called the Mad Skills Festival, which would go on for 3 or 4 days. And I would go out and I would shoot footage for them. And occasionally, I'd collaborate with people who I met there to do little performance videos, and I always had fun with it, but one of the things that I learned over time was that I was building this skill base of being able to tell a story through very minimal, like, there was no script, everything was through imagery, and that really gave me a great foundation that when I first started getting my hands on scripts from people who were up and coming directors who wanted me to shoot for them, that suddenly I had this visual language already intact from working with really talented cinematographers as an assistant for decades and also going out and shooting my own stuff and getting an idea of what looked cool and what worked and what didn't work. Um, so one of the first short films I ever shot, which was called Pass the Salt, won a bunch of awards. It debuted at the Queer Film Festival here in Vancouver, and then it went on to be featured on the what's that thing called? The short film it went on to be featured on the short film Face Off for CBC. And when I was working as a first AC on Lost in Space, I was working in Alberta in the canyons. And one night I got to go home and it was on television, the short film that I had shot. It was on the short film Face Off. So I got to turn on my TV in my hotel and say, I shot that, which was just the coolest feeling in the entire world. Um, and shortly after that, I put together a demo reel that was enough to get me some bigger jobs, which included shooting the second unit of Netflix's Babysitters Club. After that, it was COVID, which was kind of a thorn in my side because after shooting Babysitters Club, I had been told by the DP of that show, like, take a year, just shoot, don't assist anymore, and just like build your reel, work with people you want to work with. And I had tons of jobs lined up. I had web series, I had short films. There was one or two feature films that people wanted to get funded that they had me on board for. And I knew that not all of these things were going to go. But when COVID happened, everything stopped. And that left me sitting on my butt for a little while. And I still shot like from my apartment building while I was bored. Like I shot a little fan music video for an artist that I really enjoyed who released some music that year, and I shot just some other stuff around the house while I was bored. Um, and so when the Flash called to have me pull focus for them, I jumped on it because I needed the work at the time, and the Arrowverse was such a huge thing, and it was in Vancouver for a long time. So like it was kind of a prestigious position to have even as an assistant back then. While I was working on the Flash, I worked with Alvain Kumst, who's a very talented cinematographer who's been around for God forever. And we're standing out in the rain one night in the forest, and I was telling him some story about one of the short films I'd shot, and he goes, "Oh, you like to shoot short films, do you?" And I was like, "Yeah, like I want to be a DP." And he says, "Well, I've got a short film for one of the cast members that they really want me to do, but I am so tired and I'm already booked on something else. Would you do it?" And I said, "Yeah, absolutely." So he connected me with Kayla Compton, who plays Allegra on The Flash. And I shot her short film no, it wasn't even between seasons. It was at the end of The Flash season 7. So I was like, my gaffer for that short film was one of the lamp ops on The Flash. And we were talking like between setups, like they'd be blocking a scene, and I'd run out to him and I'd be like, "Hey, so I was thinking about this idea that I had for this short film." And we shot this short, and Kayla absolutely loved it, was over the moon with it, and she used it to apply to the Warner Brothers Women in the Director's Chair initiative, which she got into, and that also put my name in front of the Warner Bros. Executives. So when Alvain quit just before season 8 started, suddenly my name was in front of them. And I had the opportunity, also thanks the big, huge thank you to Ted Smith for suggesting that they consider me. When season 8 started, they came to me and they said, "You're gonna be the, second unit cinematographer for The Flash." And I was like, "Oh my god, this is amazing. Like, this is incredible." Like, when I was a kid, I loved the 1989 Batman movie. Like, I adored it. I watched it over and over again, and, like, to be part of the DC universe in whatever capacity, I was like, "This is incredible." Like, I'm so stoked on this. Originally, I was meant to be just the second unit DP, and, Brenton Spencer, the other DP, was gonna shoot the entire series. Um, at the end of the 5th episode of that season, which was, the arc that was titled Armageddon, which was their, crossover arc for that season, it was pretty clear that Brenton was exhausted and could probably use a break. So I called up the producer and I said, "Hey, I would love to try a full episode." And of course, I got the chat of, "Well, it's a big show and this, that, and the other, but we're going to give you a chance." And from there, I became the even episode director of photography for The Flash. And since then, I've just been DPing full time. It's not short, but there's my life story.
Well, you make it sound like it was kind of a easy route to where you are now, but I'm sure there were quite a lot of obstacles on the way.
Man, were there ever? Like, well, I mean, for starters, if it isn't already obvious, back in 2013, I guess, was when I came out of the closet officially as trans, which was not nearly as widely talked about back then as it is now. So that was certainly a challenge because I decided to do it on a Christian television show of all things. Which what surprised me the most about that was that how supportive the cast was of me at the time. Um, there were definitely people who took some issue with it. But what I found was a lot of the people who took issue with me being trans was I think that they just imagined that like my work ethic was gonna suffer or that I was going to come onto set wearing like full drag and like a huge dress with crinoline and like a beehive hairdo and be just like, no, I only slate when I say I'm ready to slate. Which of course is not the case. Like when I was first coming out, like there was so much on my mind because I had known that I was trans, like, my entire life. I think the first time I was able to put a word to it was when I was 14 years old, and I'd seen some awful, awful special on TLC network about, like, my husband is becoming my wife, and it really vilified the trans person in that, and when I saw that at 14 years old, I was like, "Oh, no," like, I know that that's what I am, but I don't wanna be that. And so I tried it like really hard to push it to the back of my mind. And for a while it was doable. Especially when I first started working in the industry, like it was really easy for me to just focus on the job because there was so much to remember and there was so much to get used to. And just being on set is sort of its own environment in itself. Like it's weird. It's like you're in a party, but at the same time, like you're in the military. So like there's times where you have to sort of collaborate with people and talk to people and also like be social with people and make connections. But then when someone says, whatever, depending on the position they're in, if they're your superior, you got to drop everything you're doing. You got to go do that thing. Like you get so used to hearing people's voices on set, like, oh, that's my first AC. I got to go. Um, so even just getting used to that took some time but when I started becoming more of an experienced second AC and things sort of were becoming second nature, like something was creeping in my mind, like something was wrong. And uh yeah, it was pretty I went through some pretty dark times early in my career because like I was really struggling with my identity and who I was, and I was super distracted, and it was affecting my work. Like I had to quit a TV series because I just wasn't on top of my game, and that series really demanded that I be on it because it was tons of rain, it was tons of locations, it was brain towers all the time, and I just my head wasn't in it. So I took about 6 months off and came back, and even then, like I was a little bit more sorted after that time off, and I had my head in a little bit the right place, but I wasn't ready to come out publicly yet, and that weighed on my mind. So when I finally did come out and I finally did make the announcement publicly on Facebook, and I heard later that it was the talk of the town, that like suddenly this weight was lifted off my shoulders and I could just focus on my job again. And I think that when people saw that like I was a better assistant for it and I was like nicer and friendlier and easier to get along with, that like it kind of made a lot of people's minds shift, that they were like, "Okay, this is just what she needed to do to live her life." Um, that was probably the biggest challenge of my career. Like, honestly, when I first came out, I thought I was gonna have to move to Toronto under a different name and start the training program over again in 667 and just, like, hope that everyone in Vancouver forgot who I was, which was never gonna happen. But yeah, because I remember when I was in the trainee program, they were like, "There's some really key factors that you have to remember to get ahead in the camera department. Never talk back to your superiors, never be late to set, and don't be gay." And it was like, "Oh, well, it's a good thing that was just a phase then." Um, which I understand what they mean now, especially because back then it was such a boys' club that that person really meant well when they said that, because they were trying to say, like, "This is a boys' club, and you have to get used to that, and don't give them any reason to, get their claws in you." And that's something I think has changed dramatically in the past 15 years. Um, I don't think it's entirely gone, but I think that the people who hold on to those old beliefs are much fewer and farther between, than they ever were. And I've heard people say to me like, "Oh, well, you were a trailblazer for this. You're the first gay person that I ever knew in the camera department." I take that as a huge compliment, but I also don't think that it's true. I think that there's a lot of people who paved that trail beforehand who weren't able to say it, or who got out because it was just too bad, and like, or people in other departments who had the chance to do it first. So I don't think, especially in 2013, that I would be, the first gay slash trans camera person in Vancouver. But the fact that people say that that was me is it's a huge compliment, and it's something that I do take to heart.
Absolutely. You should be proud to be considered a trailblazer
Yeah.
here in Western Canada on that. You're right about the camera department being predominantly male, and it's just statistically it is. It is getting better. In fact, the film industry in general, since in the 30 years that I've been in film, I'm seeing a lot more women in positions that I wouldn't have seen 30 years ago. Grip, electric, not just hair and makeup and wardrobe. Hopefully that'll continue, and hopefully it'll also continue more in the camera department. I am seeing better attitudes than 30 years ago, like you discussed. There were some pretty stringent unhealthy attitudes in the department that I've seen slowly um, go by the wayside, and I think that's a positive.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's a slow process, but it's getting there. And like I think we're seeing this not necessarily constrained to the camera department either. There's a lot of attitudes that are going away, and I think the people who the few that are left are getting louder about it because they're feeling more and more threatened about their ideals. Which is, it can be really discouraging sometimes, but I do feel like it's the last gasp of that, and that I think that our industry is better for it. I think that having different ideas and different personalities is going to benefit the way that we tell stories going forward.
Agreed. And in a perfect world, even people who are the loudest, like you're speaking of, who are the most threatened by change, whether it be anything in the industry, they should be given their voice as long as it's not completely destructive. However, you'd like to see people change their minds and at least be educated and more accepting.
Yeah, that's kind of There's a larger conversation to be had there, which is about the idea of free speech in general. And this is where a lot of people get very angry at trans and gay people in general because they think that we're trying to take away free speech. And it's interesting because, on a literal level, like, I don't necessarily believe in freedom of speech anymore because I've seen it abused so many times where people say that all they want is freedom of speech, but really what they want is the ability to be able to speak hatred towards one group or another. And I feel there needs to be consequences to that. Like, if someone is going to try and sabotage you in a position that you've worked hard for on set, for instance, because, like I said, there's a lot of times where people socialize and what have you. If someone's going to try and poison the water against you for none other reason other than you're a trans person or whatever, like, that should have consequences.
Agreed. Um, Something else that I find interesting that people don't necessarily take into account is with the transition from film to digital. It's positive to see that today, with more streaming services, there's more content to be had and more opportunities for diversity, equity, and equality, and for people who traditionally wouldn't have opportunities to rise up to levels of creativity now have that opportunity. So it's good to see.
Yeah, it
Uh,
is.
we have room to grow, though. So
I think so.
where do you think we can go from here? What would, in your perfect world, how could we improve on this trend?
Right now, we're really seeing a shift in the way that we make content, which has been driven by the streaming market. It's been driven by free content like on YouTube. The way that people watch things is much different now than it was 10 years ago, even, but certainly more than it was 20, 30 years ago. And um, one of the things that I think that our industry is struggling with right now is that it's trying to find its place among that. Like, I've heard so many people complain about how younger audiences prefer to watch streamers on YouTube. Um, I watch a lot of streamers on YouTube myself, and, like, to me, I think that the audiences are going to go to where the content that interests them in is. And one of the things that I think that we're struggling with right now as an industry is that ever since the Avengers Endgame, billions of dollars, there's been an expectation that every single big summer blockbuster needs to bring in billions for it to be considered a success. Um, and that's just not becoming viable anymore because when you want to reach an audience of that size, you have to appeal to the lowest common denominator. And when you're trying to bring in such a huge audience, you're trying to appeal to everybody. You're going to end up appealing to nobody because suddenly these stories aren't for anybody. And the reason that worked for the Avengers was because they had 10 years worth of building this story and having these individual characters who appealed to somebody, and eventually it brought in everyone for this huge event. And that's sort of a, I don't want to say once in a lifetime, but that's really hard to repeat. Having the expectations that the fifth Indiana Jones movie is going to bring in billions of dollars is just not realistic. And yet they still spend $250 million on it, and then another 250 million in advertising. What I would love to see is that $500 million, instead of being put into a property that realistically has nowhere left to grow, make 50 $10 million films. Whether or not they all make it to theaters is one thing. There's so much different networks available for streaming and content everywhere that it's going to find a home somewhere. And I think that's something that I would like to see more of, is just the idea of the mega movie is kind of unraveling, and I think that we're seeing that in audiences. Like, earlier this year when Madam Web came out, and that was a Sony property, but not everybody knew that because not everybody follows movies the same way that movie people do. So now there's brand confusion between what is Sony and what is Marvel. They both say Spider-Man on them, but they're two very different products. And audiences are going to start disconnecting with this really quickly, and they already have been. Um, and it's interesting seeing that the blowback to that is kind of misdirected. A lot of people are saying, like, they wanna blame one thing or another, but, like, I feel like what it is it's just fatigue, and unfortunately, the studios don't want to take chances on properties that they don't have faith in, which is understandable. But at the same time, audiences are only going to stay attached to an intellectual property for so long. And it's hard to keep telling stories with those same characters and keep them engaging. And I think that we're in an era right now where that's happening a lot and we need to move on from it.
I agree, Micah. I think everyone I know in the film industry, from PAs to DPs, everyone, we all consider ourselves creative people. Um, we we're transient. We go from show to show, and
Oh yeah.
so we consider ourselves creative. It's I'm finding the trend is less creative and more, like you're saying, a little more corporate. And I'm really hoping that that'll swing back
Yeah.
to more creativity, because I'm finding that um, smaller shows are the ones that seem to be more entertaining, at least for me,
Mhm.
as opposed to a superhero show, which tends to be a lot of explosions, a lot of CGI.
Start to tune out eventually.
Yeah, I need to see something that's a little more engaging, personally.
And like they say that like if if you like sausage, don't ever go to the sausage factory and see how it's made. But like for me, I find it really difficult, and I know that these films are very beloved, but I find it very difficult to get into the Fast Saga at all. And a big part of that is because my brain kind of switches off after X many explosions, but also because I know behind the scenes that there are contracts in place that if The Rock and Vin Diesel have a fight, that it stipulates in their contracts they need to have an equal amount of blows, and at the end of the fight, neither one of them can be seen as stronger than the other. And so for me as an audience member, like I kind of just tune out because now this fight means nothing. And like this kind of went for me as well at the end of Infinity War, for instance, when Thanos did the snap. And what the moment that I lost interest in the Marvel universe was when I saw Black Panther T'Challa get dusted, because earlier that same year, Black Panther had grossed what 2 billion at the box office. Marvel's not going to kill off that character. I knew that he was going to come back in the next movie. And Chadwick Boseman passed away, unfortunately, so he didn't get to come back for another Black Panther movie. But I knew that that character was going to live. And so suddenly anyone could come back. It meant that anything that happened in that movie that I just watched meant nothing. And suddenly I didn't care anymore. So I've actually never seen Endgame, which is for a lot of people this huge cinematic masterpiece.
Switching gears, let's talk about some of your influences as a director of photography. Who do you admire? What kind of a look? Do you have a particular style that you like to kind of pin your hat on, or do you consider yourself I can take any challenge and and change it to make a style that's suitable for the production?
I think that it's really important as a director of photography or in any position really to stay malleable and versatile, because the directors that I work with are all going to have different goals that they want to achieve. And my style is always going to bleed through no matter what. But I think that it's important that I try and sort of stay um, open to new things and be willing to change my style. Um, like when I start prepping a movie, for instance, I try and I stop watching anything except for what the director and myself have talked about in terms of like the visual style, because otherwise I don't want it to corrupt the idea of what I want to create. That being said, like of course I have so many influences. Like Bill Pope, for instance, is a huge influence for me. Like, I was such a huge fan of The Matrix when I was a kid. I mentioned earlier that I was a hockey player for a long time, but we used to drive up and down Vancouver Island going to hockey tournaments. And my dad had this like tiny little 7-inch CRT TV that would fit in between the seats of the couch or of the van, and plug into
Cigarette lighter.
the cigarette lighter
Yep.
adapter, and it had a built-in
Next to the eight
VCR.
track.
Yeah, exactly. It had a built-in VCR, so I would watch my tape copy of The Matrix just over and over again, like on the way to and from all these hockey tournaments. And his style has stayed with me, like to the point where, like, even though it's a movie that means a lot of very different things to me now than when I first watched it. Scott Pilgrim versus the World is a movie that he shot that visually is one that really still stands out to me. I really enjoy classic cinematography. Like, I really enjoy film noir. I really enjoy movies that look like movies. And like, it's not always motivated. sometimes things are gonna look a little bit more real and more gritty, and I think someone like Roger Deakins does that really, really well. Like, you can put him in different scenarios, like, look at Blade Runner 2049 versus Sicario, for instance. Like, those are 2 extremely different movies that have very different tones to them, like 2049 has this very specific sci-fi feel that's very dark and moody and uses a lot of colors and has deep shadows. And Sicario is something that's a lot more gritty. It's a little bit lower contrast, but it's because the camera is so dynamic in the way that it tells the story. And at the same time, in that movie, you still get these like beautiful vista shots, like people walking down into a tunnel from the desert sands during sunset that I can still see in my mind. Like, absolutely gorgeous. I love his work. um, I find myself very influenced by, the neo-noir movement that, like, I think that coin was sort or that I think that term was sort of coined around the time Drive came out, which is something that has, like, very classic cinematography, deep shadows, the perfect Rembrandt triangle. For those who don't know what I'm talking about, it's when you have like a three-quarter front light so that you get that perfect triangle underneath the eye of light, from the nose shadow, which is something that, like, animated films replicate a lot. I really love the use of hard color, which is, something that has been, uh, allowed through recent upgrades to camera sensors and the way that they receive light, because cameras are so much more sensitive now. It's easier for them to pick up on the hard colors like hard purples, hard reds, and like telling stories that way. Um, it's a style that I really like, and I think that that's something that you see a lot in my work on The Flash.
Fair enough. Speaking of style, what's in your kit? What do you like to use for, let's say, bodies and lenses? Uh, and if you were given carte blanche on a movie, what would be your choices?
That is such a hard question to answer. And it's funny that you ask because just this weekend we worked together on a short film, and there was a my gaffer who worked for us was an aspiring cinematographer who asked me the same thing. And it's really hard for me to answer that because when I was a camera assistant, I really prided myself on my kit because I wanted to use the tools that I knew very in and out, frontwards and backwards, like the back of my hand, because you needed to deliver results. And as a cinematographer, it's so much different. Like, I don't really own any gear and I don't plan on it. Like, a lot of guys have lenses that they really like that they rent on every single show. And I don't know if I ever want to own a set of lenses because for me, why would I want to paint the same? Why would I want to paint a different picture with the same brush every single time? I think that when I sit down and I talk to a director, one of the things that I'm really looking for when we have our discussion is what is the style that makes them tick? And I always like to say, and people respond to this statement very differently. So we'll see how it flies here. But I always like to say that all art is derivative. Everything that you've ever seen going back 1,000 years has taken its influence from something. And it's the idea that that influence mixed with your own experiences creates something new. And I think that if I mix my experiences and my influences with the directors, we're going to create something new. So for instance, if I were to be going on to a new superhero show that's going to be very visual effects heavy, my answer is going to be a lot different than the movie that I just shot in March, where it was a very in camera heavy, gritty, weird psychological thriller where I would have two very different choices. On that movie, we used the anamorphic G series from Panavision on an Arri LF camera. Um, I love large format. I really do. I love getting close to the subject and getting intimate and still having the character of the lenses from further away. Like, you can get so much closer to your subject on a 50 mil in large format and still maintain that nice flattering look. um I love that about large format, and if I had the choice I would work large format with everything that I ever worked on, which is becoming a trend. Like, you're seeing that in the modern cinema cameras, like the Venice 2, their new one, which I keep forgetting the name of, the Benito or something. I'm sorry, you can probably cut that out. um
We'll look that up later.
yeah. But you're seeing a trend right now, which I find very fascinating, where Because cameras and sensors are being pushed in to their limits and beyond anything we've ever seen before, we're seeing a lot of old lenses being resurrected because suddenly they're useful again.
Yep.
Where a lens like a 2.8 anamorphic was out of favor for a while in the early days of digital because camera sensors were only ISO 320 at best. Now that ISOs are reaching 2500 and beyond in their native capacity and they look great with little to no noise, you can put those lenses on and still shoot in low light conditions and it'll still look amazing. Um, I kind of feel like, and this is another one that people have disagreed with me on. I feel like selecting a camera body nowadays is like selecting a film stock back in the days of film because every camera processes light differently. Like an like Aries color science is very specifically tailored to process highlights. And the Venice, for instance, is very specifically tailored to deal with low tones and high ISOs. And if you talk to still shooters who use Sony cameras versus, say, a Fuji camera, they will always tell you that Fuji will come out with better skin tones. And you can make a Sony camera look better, but it's going to take more time in post production. So, if I'm going onto a show where I know I have a digital imaging technician sitting beside me at all times, then I might choose the Venice because I know that they're going to have the time to tweak it and make it look really, really nice. Whereas if I know I'm going on to a show like we did this weekend where there's no time to do anything, we're running with our hair on fire and we just have to get it in the can, then I'm going to choose something that has the best capabilities to deal with harsh conditions like the Airy. If I were to choose, like, my dream project, say I got to shoot like a Star Trek movie, for instance. I love Star Trek movies, I really do. I hope we get some, like, new ones someday. Like, I really enjoyed the J.J. Abrams one. I think they're completely different, than the previous Star Trek movies before that, but I think that kinda makes them unique and interesting. One of my favorite movies of all time is First Contact, Star Trek 8. I love that so much. So, say I'm given a Star Trek movie, and if I were to pick like my dream lenses and my dream camera package, I would probably pick the Arri LF or the Arri 35. I'd have to put them side by side. People really are favoring the 35 right now, but I'd love to see like what their sensors look like side by side on a similar lens. Let's say for now I'm going to choose the LF. For lenses, it would be a Panavision series. It would probably be an older series, and this would depend on how much visual effects are happening in this movie. But let's say that there's a lot of in-camera effects that we're doing. I would probably choose something weird, like the Anamorphic C series or the B series, like old, lots of character. There's only one set in the entire world, so don't bust them. So the thing is, we'll probably never see them in North America because they're probably over in Europe shooting something really cool right now. So that would be my choice.
Well, maybe they'll just send you over to Europe to do the Star Trek
There we
movie, right?
go. Yeah, send me to Europe.
What's next for Mikah Sharkey?
Let's see. What's next for me? Coming up later this year, hopefully will be the release of the feature that I shot in March, which when we shot it was called Brother. Whether or not it retains that name is yet to be seen. It's a really interesting independent feature that's shot by a company in Alberta called Ready Made Productions, who's kind of striving to be like the Canadian A24 in the way that they do things. They're really like their priorities have a lot to do with the creativity of the people involved. The director that I worked on that with, Sam Fitchner, is super talented. I've rarely seen a more prepared director, and the way that he approaches performances and the way that he approaches telling the story with the camera was something I really admired. So I'm really looking forward to seeing that project finished. Um, and apart from that, it's trying to get over the strike we just had and
Mm,
hopefully trying to find something that puts a bit of money in my pocket for a little bit
absolutely. Well, I'm sure that'll happen very soon.
in time.
Last question for you. What advice would you give to up and comers?
My advice for up and comers is probably going to be one that they don't want to hear. But I want to say to get involved with the craft at the very base level and really give yourself a foundation that's going to support you through the rest of your career. I see a lot of folks who want to shoot movies, and I really respect the passion. But I see a lot of people who just don't have the experience to know how it's done and tell their best stories and end up getting burnt out or frustrated because the idea of shooting movies is overwhelming. Um, like I really value my time as a camera assistant, and I learned so much from so many people. I would say, like, take your time to learn from people who really know the craft and be patient because you'll get your opportunities. And when you do, you want to be able to say with confidence that you did your best and you weren't just swinging for the fences before you were ready. That may sound ironic coming from me, who's like 35 years old and in the DP's chair. I know I'm very young for this position, but I would think that I learned so much working for really talented cinematographers during my time as an assistant.
Thank you for taking the time, Micah.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for letting me talk your ear off.
Well, that about wraps it up for another episode of Crew Tales, Life in the Circus. I'd like to thank our producers Dustin Schwinnard and Dustin Girton, as well as our technical producer Rob Hunt. I'm Brad Hodson. Thank you for joining us.